Good afternoon. I've been asked more than once since arriving what the subtitle of this talk is, because it is rather vague. Weimar Imaginaries. The subtitle of this talk, if I were to give it one, would be Rereading George Mosse's Memoir. And having heard these wonderful talks already today, I'm so tempted to just start talking to those people, but I will tell you what I've come here to tell you instead. Writing a birthday present paper to share with people who loved George Mosse so well during his lifetime, when I didn't have that good fortune, turns out to be a vexing task, made even more complex by my debt for the results of his work that have been so consequential in enabling the possibility of my own, especially his clearing of space for historical thinking about visual culture, sexuality, the power of emotion, and also the significance of teaching. But it's with his insistence on the category of the political, about which we've heard today already too, that I would like to begin, because I would be curious to know what George Mosse would have said about what is happening in the place where he spent most of his life, namely the United States, where, since the 2016 election, references to the Weimar Republic show up nearly daily in the press as a shorthand for the demise of democracy, and after all, over 60 million people voted against respectability. These mini excursions, however, nonetheless precisely do not refer explicitly to Weimar's German Jewish intellectual life, the reconstruction of which Mosse called, as we have also already heard today, his profession of faith. The American press has this in common with the recently celebrated German miniseries, Babylon Berlin, in which the version of Berlin to which we are treated could pass for the Stadt fast ohne Juden. Whatever its virtues, the degree to which the series imagines the Jew barely there multiplies through its vagaries. In this way, in fact, the show seems to portray a more profound matter than the narrative itself, pointing not just to the Weimar-era film Stadt ohne Juden, but also the realization of a world without Jews, and thus posing a question about what this series' enthusiastic spectatorship might imply. For example, Babylon Berlin's police chief Benda clearly refers to Bernhard Weiss, who, among other things, acted against anti-Semitism more deliberately than the largely benevolent, slightly mumbling, and inexact Benda character. Weiss, however, does appear in George Mosse's posthumously published memoir, Confronting History, on which I primarily want to concentrate today. He must have made a deep impression, since Mosse noted both in his memoir and elsewhere that though Weiss made it to England, by the time that happened, he had, quote, been driven to near insanity by the relentless attacks of the Nazis, end quote. And though I would want to know the details of what Mosse might say to those of us wondering what will become of the United States, he wrote already in The Crisis of German Ideology that it was, quote, never the size of the groups that counted, but rather the institutions they infected and the mood they spread and maintained until the moment was right. I would have preferred to hear him talk about that moment, this moment we're living through, but I will take this relatively early Mossian answer on the subject of the insidiousness of nativism and democracy's demise, and turn instead to what he had to say about himself, and the moment of promise and collapse into which he was born, a moment in which he was indeed, as he often insisted, barely there. I am interested in considering some of the ways that Weimar's promise takes on connotative status in the memoir in both its unpublished and published iterations, functioning as a site of both definite and elusive meaning, of the speculative, of the might have been. I direct my comments then to the status of an imaginary in Mosse, the Weimar Imaginary. In the memoir specifically, Weimar does not enjoy the explanations it receives in Mosse's scholarship. It is presented rather as a statement of fact, a set of conditions stated as such, but I think it is also the navel of the dream. In the absence of a full biography of George Mosse, this text is all the more remarkable for its place in relationship to the extensive biographical work that has been done on the Mosse family, foregrounding its own staging and referring regularly to its own elisions. In the longer version of this piece, I will explore in more detail than I can here the psychoanalytic matters thus invoked. But for today, I want to focus on examples of the speculative mode in Mosse's self-narration when it comes to his treatment of two different categories in his rendering of the Weimar Republic as his own site of origin and as a favored site of return. Those categories are homosexuality and women through his rendering of his mother and sister. Weimar was for George Mosse a weighted invocation, but it was also, as he was careful to caution, one that was almost entirely an invocation. In his memoir, he notes that when asked to describe the experience of Weimar, he would demur, reminding the inquirer that he was only a child at the time. How much could he possibly remember? Quote, "It is ironic when today's students ask me what it must have been like to experience the excitement of cultural life in the Weimar Republic. My experience was quite different from that of adults, and those who ask this question today do not want to hear about German nationalism or boarding schools," end quote. In his memoir, Mosse is also explicit, though, about his early pre-boarding school memories and all that these implied for him. In his estimation, these too, though, are not the stories students wanted to hear. For him, they are shadowy, that's the word he uses repeatedly, shadowy memories vital to the story he tells about himself. Quote, "My preoccupation with politics had been latent ever since birth. I was born, after all, into the stormy beginning of the Weimar Republic, and the few memories I can recall from my earliest years are all political," end quote. Mosse's repeated declarations about having virtually no memory are matched by the fragments that he does offer, many of them taking place in his family's homes. His favored use of the metaphorics, which we have already heard invoked today, of a fully furnished house in speech that one finds in his taped lectures and interviews might itself have its resonance precisely with that shadowy memory of the Weimar household in which politics came to dinner, allowing for an articulation of the potency of politics and the vibrancy of an intellectual life that he missed even as he remembers the circumstances. In this repetitive formulation, Weimar functions as a site from which to say something very specific through negation, a statement about what he did not experience, what he does not remember. Not remembering or knowing for certain conjures the condition of faith, too, and that is precisely how he described his relation to Weimar in the lectures that became German Jews Beyond Judaism. He called that book his most personal, almost a confession of faith during his lifetime, with his profession of faith in Bildung. Quote, "It was the German Jewish Bildungsbürgertum which more than any other single group preserved Germany's better self across dictatorship, war, Holocaust, and defeat," end quote. In other words, Mosse's relation to Weimar, as he described it, is not reducible to the biographical facts of his birth, but is also a matter of sustenance in the speculative. One of the chapters of the memoir begins thus emblematically in the subjunctive. Quote, "My life would have been different had circumstances allowed me to remain in Germany." His father, he tells us, expected to return to Berlin after the war and restart the family paper, a New Berliner Tageblatt. Quote, "It would not have worked," Mosse writes matter-of-factly and speculatively too. Quote, "No one who came back from exile and reclaimed a pre-Nazi newspaper was destined to succeed," end quote. I'm not sure who he's talking about. But the affective power of the statement for its clarity about a Weimar that is irretrievably lost stands, appearing in Mosse's work as a consistent specter, as site of a world he could refer to from memory but not inhabit, as does the persistence of a subjunctive and speculative mode. The Weimar he missed was one in which he barely appeared and had no power of consequence. Even so, or perhaps especially so, as he relays in the memoir, Weimar was part of him, animated his view of history, playing a part, as he wrote, in the restlessness that drove him. In the memoir, he positioned Berlin's status as gay Mecca of the 1920s alongside his perception of the vibrancy of Jewish intellectual life at the time without making any direct claim on the former. But the invocation is clear and sits alongside his perceptions of Jewishness in the city at that time. In the unedited draft of the memoir submitted to the University of Wisconsin Press just weeks before he died, George Mosse used the word gay to refer to himself, indicating a certain comfort with this part of his life and the historical moment in which he wrote. The press, however, initially changed the word gay to the more clinical homosexuality in key passages, thus making not just a rhetorical choice, but also altering what would otherwise read as politically declarative. Despite Mosse's willingness to write about himself as gay, he makes few allowances for his own struggle in his narrative, and when he does, these are layered between disavowals. The insidiousness of homophobia in the story he tells then shows up instead in the speculative once again, in the what might have been, as over against a Weimar imaginary, not confined, therefore, to the Weimar years. He notes on multiple occasions that he, quote, does not understand why for so long he did not have, quote, real friendships, end quote. Nonetheless, linking this fact rhetorically, immediately to his homosexuality. One example of his student days at Haverford, for example, he writes that I, quote, do not know why both here and later at Harvard few lasting and continuous friendships developed, or why I stayed in touch with hardly any of my friends from school. He follows this with an observation that, quote, my sexual orientation has not intruded much into this account up to now, followed again by a disavowal, partly because I never experienced a trauma of despair that has driven other homosexual young people close to suicide because of the discrimination and the insults directed against them. It was a little like the reason for the low rate of desertion of German soldiers on the Russian front during the Second World War. Where were they going to desert to? This made it somewhat easier to accept a silence which seemed inevitable and for which I could compensate, end quote. Now, I could spend a much longer time than I have on just that passage, but I will focus here only on his notion of compensation, because some of the details of that compensation are the reason that so many of us are here today. They are a matter of Mosse's professionalization, his commitments to scholarship, teaching, and friendship that sustained him. I would have been kicked out, was not possible, he says, of coming out of the closet earlier. I became convinced early on that any distinction I might achieve in my work depended upon a focusing of those energies in the classroom, which I might have extended or expended upon a sexual relationship. Today, this seems a rationalization, but at the time, these were genuinely held beliefs. Turning once again to the subjunctive, he continues, how matters would have turned out if the environment were less hostile, I cannot say. He could not say. Relatedly, he refers to colleagues that he knew were gay, but with whom he never spoke about such things, claiming of his Wisconsin colleague Harvey Goldberg, for example, that, quote, we never mentioned such matters, that taboo was too strong to be broken, not just on his side, but on mine as well. How many other such conversations did he not have? I have many questions about the closeted Norbert Elias in this regard. For example, Mosse could not say, yet all of us here are the beneficiaries of his decisions about his work, not just the arguments he made, but how he made them, and also the condition under which he labored that included, in addition to all the things it gave him, also the hum of potential and possible expulsion from its ranks. However accustomed he was to that hum, he always heard it. And bracketing that kind of institutional power in historical writing about him elides something very consequential and insidious in which the profession remains both complicit and implicated. Mosse's decisions required a negotiation with an openly and implicitly hostile culture and profession, unreflective as it had long been about its own homosociality, however much Mosse's own historical arguments might have exemplified the relevance of that situation. In the memoirs elsewhere, he also cultivated his own shadow cabinet of gay thinkers and advisors whose significance is redoubled for their mobilization in the memoir too. Theodor Mommsen, Klaus Mann, Winkelmann, among others, through whom he was able to say something more about, among other things, the threat of humiliation on which respectability relies. They passed muster for their status and relevant contributions, of course, but bore repeating for him perhaps also, both for their tragic endings and for the sustenance they provided. Robert Nye's writing mirrors Mosse's own rhetorical turn and at least alludes to something similar when he notes that Winkelmann represents the pivot of the image of man, quote, in more ways than one can say, quote. The specter of respectability on which Mosse's contributions pivot is the threat of humiliation, a factor that Mosse waves away in his rendering of his own life, despite the labor of compartmentalization that characterized it. He does this when he writes about his own experiences of anti-Semitism, too, which he minimizes despite obvious and not so obvious evidence to the contrary. In the memoir, though, one finds the critical underside of what he communicates in relationship to his sexuality by implication or by single lines, where he dwells on the power of maintaining appearances in his work with the clarity that comes not only from erudition, but with the clarity that the prospect of shaming brings. When asked in the early 1990s in a German interview why he wrote about sexuality and homosexuality in particular, he still equivocated, "Es lag mir nah." And rather than elaborating, as he often did in interviews, he would often tell his interviewers that what they needed to do was go read his books. In this instance, his early engagement, he recommended his early engagement with the topic in his Crisis of German Ideology. In the memoir, the closest he comes to illustrating his own shame beyond enforced silence is in the stories he tells of Kurt Hahn, the Jewish and gay rector of his boarding school, who, Mosse reports, would stand at the window of the boarding school and yell down to him with special zeal, "Schlappschwanz." In his English memoir, he uses this German word, a denigration on which he does not further comment, translating it instead as weakling. Notably, it is in relation only to Hahn in the memoir that he allows himself rare repudiation. Respectability, Mosse wrote in the concluding paragraph of Nationalism and Sexuality, a book he called his coming out book, provided society with an essential cohesion that was as important in the perception of men and women as any economic or political interests. Was the price, he asked, exacted for this morality too high? This depends upon how the conflict between society's felt need for cohesion and tolerance of the outsider can be resolved. As with much of Mosse's work, one can discern the foreshadowing of contemporary theory in which he did not participate in this formulation of, quote, society's felt need. Mosse paid a price, even if he disavowed it in the end or claimed not to care or notice. I want to remember him for that, too. The history of the life, I promised my voice would not catch when I said this. The history of the life of a closeted man, even a celebrated and life-affirming historian like George Mosse, is not only the history of the irretrievable story that cannot be told because the record is scant. It's not just about a scant record. It is also about the story of what was not, what could not be. What he is not and will not be remembered for, though, is an early interest in women's history. This story would be another paper altogether and one worth writing to, but it is no small matter that even as their personalities clashed, pioneering women's historian Gerda Lerner valued her friendship with him as she did and was willing to say so in her eulogy for him. What I want to emphasize here, though, is that the late life memoir, especially in its original and unpublished form, there Mosse demonstrates an interest and empathy for women's lives that I would have wished to have been retained in the text and was not. Of the profession, he noted bracingly in that original draft that what he called the, quote, formerly radical historians would have rejected the field in which, quote, Wisconsin was once again to be a pioneer, women's history. His criticism of colleagues in that same paragraph, whom he called, quote, patriarchal at best, were deleted by editors as well and did not appear in the published version of the book. It also becomes clear from the draft that the story of women in Mosse's family remains to be told. He provided some openings in his telling of their relation to him, making claims that are similar to the ones he makes about his relationship to Weimar. He was there, present, only barely, but he reaches nonetheless. In his telling, gender and Weimar converge through his sister Hilda and mother Felicia. The Weimar that Mosse was asked about when students inquired over decades, he associates most strongly with his sister, the eldest of the three children, who, as he writes, was active as a volunteer for the poor and in the youth movement, and whose political leanings were decidedly to the left. He saw her early engagement as emancipatory and emblematic of Weimar. She participated in Jewish life, and among her papers, Among her papers are the carefully preserved fragments of the pamphlet from an event in 1931 hosted by Else Schulhof, ein Berliner Salon 1800, ein Abend bei Rahel Levin. Hilda had also voted for the Social Democrats in 28, breaking family tradition and causing dissension. Quote, "My parents' indignation was boundless." Mosse remembers, Hilda shielded George from much, it seems, and he knew it. She, like her brother, however, acted with conviction, particularly on behalf of racial justice, and without ruining her respectability, though she, like her brother, took risks in her personal life that could have made her vulnerable had they become public. This appears to have extended to details about her adult life. Even as he narrates their closeness, though, Mosse marks the kind of limits I have tried to suggest were significant and prohibitive. He never revealed his homosexuality to her, and he states unequivocally that Hilda thought homosexuality was degenerate. The speculative what might have been runs once more alongside the story about their closeness. I note here that the year of Hilda's death is also the year that George Mosse first self-identified as gay at an Amsterdam conference. But Hilda's position is made even more significant by what it might mean about their mother, for whom she cared in New York for decades. George described his mother Felicia in the memoir as volatile, difficult, in the 1920s often absent, and in exile, isolated, taking to her bed. However, it may have been in relation to her that he had the conversation about homosexuality with Hilda that he did not have about himself. As I have noted, since delivery of the manuscript came just weeks before George Mosse's passing, decisions were made regarding edits and even the title without his input, some of them more challenging than others. Reading the drafts deposited at the Leo Baeck, a further amplification of the choice to turn his gayness into homosexuality appears in a surprising deletion. What reads as a mobilization of Mossian empathy to think about his mother's plight, and to my mind, to offer a kind of tribute to her while acknowledging their distance and to the what might have been, was excised. The final and published version of one of the lengthier descriptions of a memory with his mother reads as follows in the published book, quote, "The happiest I saw her was when surrounded by beautiful Russian women visiting Schenkendorf. I am not sure if I should draw any conclusions from the presence of these beautiful young women surrounding my mother." The full text, as submitted to the press, however, was less ambiguous about what he thought about this memory. "I am not sure if I should draw any conclusions from the presence of these beautiful young women surrounding my mother, though a cousin told me decades later that my mother was well known in Berlin as a lesbian. I was, of course, quite unaware of this rumor, and even if it were true, it would only be part of her burden causing her hysterical outbursts that I witnessed often enough, though they were never directed at me." Mosse did try several times in his text to make sense of these, quote, outbursts, which clearly impacted him significantly, and of the pressures on his mother as a Jewish woman in the circumstance in which she found herself. In this instance, what he respectfully calls the, quote, rest of that burden had to do with the fact that Felicia Mosse was biologically Rudolf Mosse's daughter by another woman, Fräulein Marx. She was legally adopted only in 1919, after she already had 3 children of her own, having learned of her status from a civil servant who refused to be bribed on the day she was married. In what one imagines might be the youngest son's devotion to his mother's respectability, though he includes some of these details elsewhere, he was resolute. I have not seen anywhere where he acknowledges knowledge of who his biological grandmother was, although he most certainly knew. Nor does he reveal the extent of his mother's mental instability, for which there is, however, substantial archival evidence. Moreover, he shows a sensitivity to her isolation, noting both in the memoir and incredulously in a taped interview from the 1970s, when he's asked, first of all, about his parents, he speaks first of his mother, and he says with great conviction, what she did with her life was nothing. She could not, as a woman of her social class, nothing. That she was a known lesbian, however, was consigned to the archive despite his efforts, though it did not materialize. His solicitation of an article on lesbianism in the 1920s for the important 1982 special issue on the history of sexuality of the Journal of Contemporary History, he wrote, "It would fit very well because that is a subject that is neglected in the issue as it stands." Mosse not only allowed but also relied in his memoir upon the grammar of not knowing or even maybe knowing, for important aspects of his story. The Berliner Tageblatt could not be restarted, but he wrote against the Weimar he missed nonetheless. Many regularly note that he resisted totalizing notions generally, but he also separated himself from the often pugnacious rhetoric of his peers by not writing totalizing history either. And, as in the passage I quoted earlier, opening out to inquiry. Was the price exacted for morality too high? For Mosse, historical oblivion and self-delusion were dangerous and also, importantly, eminently comprehensible. The latter point being perhaps the most surprisingly consistent and, to return to the beginning of my remarks, politically important today. His classic liberalism did not detract from the urgency he communicated in his work, nor did it provide a way out of a radicalized notion of understanding. When it came to producing his memoir, this rhetorical and also ethical commitment to refuse a final answer stands, and it remains, in my view, for his readers to enact it in both directions, as I have tried to begin to do here. First, by noticing the questions he left open, and by returning to the archive to think through Mosse's worldview again, a worldview that he earned by way of both privilege and painful exclusion. The least we can do is try to read, as he wrote, the story he left us, allowing for the last gift of the speculative to carry its weight. Thank you.